The elevator doors opened with a soft ding on the 47th floor, revealing one of the most expensive apartments in all of New York City. Alexander stepped out, loosening his tie after another long day of making money he didn't really need. At 30, he had more wealth than most people could spend in 10 lifetimes. Thanks to the tech company his father built from nothing, the apartment stretched out before him like a palace in the sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the glittering city below, where millions of people were heading home from their regular jobs. But Alexander barely glanced at the view anymore. He was used to living above the clouds. Every piece of furniture in his home cost more than most people's cars. The marble floors were so shiny you could see your reflection, and the crystal chandelier hanging in the entrance hall was worth more than a house in the suburbs. But despite all this luxury, the apartment felt cold and empty. It was beautiful, yes, but it had no soul. In the center of the main living room sat Alexander's most prized possession, a black Steinway grand piano worth over $200,000. It was perfect in every way, its surface polished too, mirror-like perfection. The keys were made of the finest ivory, and every detail had been crafted by master craftsmen. Yet this magnificent instrument served only one purpose in Alexander's life: to impress visitors. He couldn't play a single note. The piano had been his mother's idea, back when she was still alive and trying to give her son some culture. Every proper home needs music, she used to say. But after she passed away 5 years ago, the piano became just another expensive decoration. Like the paintings on the walls or the sculptures in the corners, Alexander walked past the silent piano every day, sometimes running his fingers along its smooth surface, but never lifting the lid to touch the keys. What was the point? He was too busy making money to learn something as impractical as music. Besides, he told himself, some things were better left to professionals. His daily routine was as predictable as clockwork. Wake up at 6, check the stock market, shower, dress in clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and head to his office downtown. He would spend 12 hours making business deals, attending meetings, and growing his already massive fortune. Then he would return to his empty apartment, eat dinner alone while watching the news, and go to bed. Repeat. The loneliness didn't bother him much anymore, or at least that's what he told himself. He had learned to fill the silence with work. With the constant buzzing of his phone, with the noise of success, friends were a luxury he couldn't afford, not because of money, but because of time and trust. When you're worth hundreds of millions, it's hard to know who likes you for yourself, who likes you for your bank account. This isolated routine changed when Alexander realized his apartment was becoming too much for him to manage alone. Despite having the best of everything, dust still settled on surfaces. Clothes still needed washing, and meals still needed preparing. He needed help, but not just any help. He needed someone invisible, someone who could maintain his perfect world without disturbing his perfect routine. That's when Isabella entered his life, though he barely noticed her arrival. She was 28 years old, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. She had traveled thousands of miles from her home in South America, leaving behind everything familiar for a chance at a better life in America, but dreams she had learned were expensive things. Isabella had grown up in a small city where music filled the streets, and every family had some connection to the arts. Her own family had been comfortable once, not rich, but comfortable enough for her to attend the best music school in the country. She had spent 15 years learning to play piano, practicing for hours every day until her fingers could dance across the keys like they were born to make music. But life has a way of changing course when you least expect it. Economic problems hit her country hard, and her family lost almost everything overnight. Her father's business collapsed, her mother became sick, and suddenly Isabella's dreams of becoming a concert pianist seemed as distant as the stars. She had a choice to make: stay home and watch her family struggle, or go to America and work whatever job she could find to send money back home. The choice wasn't really a choice at all, so here she was, in Alexander's gleaming apartment, wearing a simple uniform and carrying a bucket of cleaning supplies. Her music degree hung on the wall of her tiny studio apartment across town, but it might as well have been on another planet. In America, she wasn't Isabella the pianist. She was just another immigrant cleaning lady invisible to the people whose homes she maintained. Alexander hired her through an agency, the same way he hired everyone who worked for him. He didn't want to deal with personal connections or emotional complications, just wanted someone reliable who could keep his apartment spotless and stay out of his way. Isabella fit perfectly into this arrangement. She was quiet, efficient, and almost ghost-like in how she moved through his space. Every morning, Isabella would arrive at 8 o'clock sharp, after Alexander had already left for work. She would clean every surface until it sparkled, organize everything perfectly, and prepare simple meals that Alexander would reheat when he came home. By the time he returned each evening, she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of cleaning products and the evidence of her invisible labor. For months, this arrangement worked perfectly. Alexander lived his life of luxury and business deals, while Isabella maintained the backdrop of his success. They rarely spoke beyond simple instructions and polite greetings. He saw her as a service, not a person. She saw him as a paycheck, not a human being. But every day, as Isabella cleaned the apartment, her eyes would drift to that magnificent piano, sitting silent in the living room. Her fingers would itch to touch those keys, to bring music back into her life, even for just a moment. But she knew better than to cross that line. The piano was worth more than she would earn in 5 years, and she couldn't risk losing this job. Her family back home depended on every dollar she sent. Still, sometimes when she was dusting around the piano, Isabella would hum softly to herself, old songs from her childhood, pieces she had once performed on stage, melodies that lived in her heart even when her hands couldn't play them. She didn't know that sometimes Alexander came home early and heard her humming through the walls. He never mentioned it, but something about those soft melodies stirred memories of his mother, of a time when his apartment had felt more like a home. Neither of them realized that their carefully maintained distance was about to crumble, that a single moment of thoughtless entertainment would reveal truths that would change both their lives forever. The piano sat waiting, holding its silence, ready to become the bridge between two worlds that seemed impossible to connect. 3 months had passed since Isabella started working for Alexander, and their routine had become as predictable as sunrise. She would arrive clean and disappear before he returned home. They existed in the same space, but lived in completely different worlds. That was about to change in the most unexpected way. It was a Friday evening in late October when Alexander decided to host one of his quarterly dinner parties. These weren't celebrations or fun gatherings. They were business, disguised as social events. It's a chance for wealthy investors to network, make deals, and show off their success to each other. Alexander's apartment was the perfect backdrop for such performances. With its expensive art and breathtaking city views, the guest list read like a who's who of New York's financial elite. There was Richard, a hedge fund manager who owned 3 houses and a yacht. Catherine, a real estate mogul who bought and sold buildings like trading cards. David, a tech entrepreneur who had just sold his company for $500 million. And Jennifer, an art dealer who could spot a fake masterpiece from across a room, but couldn't spot genuine human emotion if it slapped her in the face. Isabella had been asked to work late that evening, serving drinks and appetizers to the guests. She moved through the apartment like a shadow, refilling wine glasses and clearing empty plates while the wealthy visitors talked and laughed loudly. Their conversations revolved around stock prices, vacation homes, and expensive purchases. To them, Isabella was just part of the furniture, useful but invisible. Alexander played the perfect host, moving from group to group with practiced charm. He had learned long ago that being rich wasn't enough in these circles. You had to perform your wealth, display it like a peacock showing its feathers. The dinner had cost more than most people earned in a month, but for Alexander and his guests, it was just another Tuesday. As the evening progressed and the wine flowed freely, the conversations became louder and more boastful. Richard was telling everyone about his new Ferrari. Catherine was describing her latest property acquisition. David was bragging about his art collection. The atmosphere became thick with competition and ego. It was during dessert that Alexander noticed Isabella dusting the bookshelf near the piano. Something about the scene struck him as amusing. Here was this simple cleaning lady, working while they enjoyed their expensive meal. He had been drinking wine all evening, and the alcohol made him feel playful and bold. An idea formed in his mind, the kind of idea that seems hilarious when you're drunk, but horrifying when you're sober. "Hey everyone, look at this," Alexander called out, his voice carrying across the room. The conversation stopped as all eyes turned to him. He was grinning like a teenager who had just thought of a prank. "See that piano over there? It cost me more than most people's houses. It's $200,000 for the finest craftsmanship money can buy." His guests nodded appreciatively, making the appropriate impressed sounds. They were used to Alexander showing off his possessions, but they sensed something different in his tone tonight. "You know what's funny?" Alexander continued, walking toward Isabella with unsteady steps. "I've had this masterpiece for 5 years, and it's never been played. Not once. It just sits there looking expensive." He paused for dramatic effect, enjoying the attention from his audience. "Isabella here is always so serious, always working. I bet she's never even touched a piano key in her life." Isabella froze, her cleaning cloth still in her hand. She could feel all eyes on her now, and her cheeks began to burn with embarrassment. She had been in situations like this before, moments when wealthy employers decided to use their staff as entertainment. It never ended well for the employee. "Alexander, what are you thinking?" Catherine asked with a laugh that sounded more cruel than amused. "I'm thinking we should have some entertainment," Alexander replied, his grin growing wider. "Isabella, come here. I want you to play something for our guests." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Isabella's heart began racing. She knew she should refuse politely and return to her work, but Alexander was her employer. No, to him in front of his friends, could cost her the job she desperately needed. "Sir, I really should finish cleaning," Isabella said quietly, hoping he would drop the idea. But Alexander was enjoying himself too much to stop now. The wine had made him feel powerful and amusing, and his friends were watching with anticipation. He had become the star of his own cruel show. "Nonsense. The cleaning can wait. This is a party." Alexander gestured grandly toward the piano. "Look at this beautiful instrument, just sitting there unused. Surely you can bang out 'Mary Had a Little Lamb' or something simple. How hard can it be?" His guests chuckled at this, and Isabella felt her face grow even hotter. She glanced around the room, looking for any escape, but there was none. 8 pairs of wealthy eyes stared at her expectantly, waiting for their evening's entertainment. "I don't think this is a good idea, sir," Isabella tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come on, don't be shy," Richard chimed in, clearly. "Enjoying the spectacle? We're all friends here. To have some fun with it." "Yes, let's see what our money is paying for," David added with a smirk. Alexander walked over to the piano and lifted the lid with ceremonial flair, revealing the pristine keys beneath. The instrument seemed to gleam under the apartment's expensive lighting, waiting like a stage for the performance that was about to unfold. "There we go," Alexander announced proudly. "The stage is set. Isabella, your audience awaits." Isabella stood frozen for a long moment, torn between the humiliation of the situation and the desperate need to keep her job. She could feel tears threatening to form in her eyes, but she forced them back. She had survived worse than this. She could survive a few minutes of embarrassment if it meant continuing to send money home to her family, slowly, with as much dignity as she could manage. Isabella walked toward the piano. Each step felt like walking to her own execution. The guests watched her with the same fascination people have when watching a car accident, horrified but unable to look away. "This should be interesting," Jennifer whispered to Catherine, loud enough for Isabella to hear. Alexander raised his wine glass in a mock toast. "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare to be amazed by our very own house concert pianist." As Isabella reached the piano bench, she paused and looked back at the room full of expectant faces. They were all waiting for her to embarrass herself, to fumble through some simple tune and confirm their assumptions about who she was and what she was worth. They saw her as nothing more than entertainment, an amusing interlude. Between their important conversations about money and status, what none of them knew was that they were about to witness something that would shatter every assumption they had. "Maid," Isabella took a deep breath, placed her cleaning cloth on the side table, and sat down at the piano bench. Her hands trembled slightly as she positioned them over the keys, but not from nervousness. After months of silence, she was finally going home. Isabella sat at the piano bench, her back straight and her hands resting gently on her lap. The room behind her buzzed with quiet conversations and the soft clinking of wine glasses. She could hear Richard whispering something to Catherine, probably making jokes about what was about to happen. David was already reaching for his phone, likely preparing to record what he expected would be an amusing disaster. For a moment, Isabella closed her eyes and let herself remember. She thought about her childhood home, where an old upright piano sat in the corner of their small living room. She remembered her grandmother's wrinkled hands guiding her tiny fingers to the right keys, teaching her first simple melodies when she was just 5 years old. She remembered the pride in her parents' eyes when she played her first recital, wearing a white dress her mother had sewn by hand. She remembered the conservatory, where she had spent the happiest years of her life surrounded by other young musicians, who understood that music wasn't just sound, it was a language that could express everything the heart couldn't say in words. She remembered her professor, Maestro Rodriguez, who had told her she had a gift, a connection to music that couldn't be taught or bought. Most of all, she remembered the last time she had performed in public at the National Theater in her hometown. The audience had given her a standing ovation that lasted for 5 minutes. That night, she had felt like she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was born to do. That was 3 years ago, before everything changed, before she had to pack her dreams into a suitcase and carry to a foreign country where nobody knew her name or cared about her gift. But now, sitting at this magnificent piano worth more than her family had ever owned, Isabella felt something stirring inside her chest. It was like a sleeping giant waking up after a long rest. Her fingers began to tingle with anticipation. And suddenly, she wasn't thinking about the mocking laughter or the cruel entertainment. She was thinking about coming home. Isabella opened her eyes and looked down at the pristine keys. They seemed to glow under the apartment's expensive lighting, each one perfectly white and black, arranged in the same pattern she had known since childhood. Piano keys were the same everywhere: in her grandmother's house, in the conservatory, in concert halls, and here in this cold apartment high above the city. They were universal, like a language everyone could understand if they just listened. She lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys, feeling the familiar cool touch of ivory against her fingertips. If everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the show to begin, Alexander stood near the wall, his wine glass in hand, still wearing that amused smile that expected nothing more than a few fumbled notes and nervous laughter. Isabella chose her piece carefully. She could have played something simple, something that would meet their low expectations and let her escape with minimal embarrassment. But as her hands found their position on the keys, she realized she was tired of hiding. She was tired of being invisible, tired of pretending to be less than she was, tired of letting other people's assumptions define her worth. She was going to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most technically demanding and emotionally powerful pieces in the classical piano repertoire. It was a piece that required not just perfect technique, but soul. It was a piece that told a story of struggle and triumph, of darkness and light, of dreams that refused to die even when the world tried to kill them. Isabella took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes were soft and gentle, like a whisper in the dark. Her left hand established a simple melody, while her right hand added delicate harmonies. The sound that came from the piano was so pure and clear that it seemed to cut through the air like a blade of light. This wasn't the stumbling amateur performance everyone expected. This was something else entirely. Within seconds, the atmosphere in the room completely changed. The quiet conversations stopped mid-sentence. Wine glasses were set down on tables without a sound. Catherine's phone, which she had been scrolling through with bored disinterest, slipped from her fingers and landed silently on the couch beside her. As Isabella continued to play, the music began to build in complexity and intensity. Her fingers moved across the keys with impossible speed and precision, executing passages that most professional pianists would find challenging. But more than just technical skill, there was something deeper happening. The music wasn't just being played. It was being lived, felt, breathed into existence. Alexander's smug smile faded from his face as he realized what he was hearing. This wasn't a cleaning lady pretending to play piano. This was a master musician speaking in her native language. And the language was beautiful beyond anything he had ever experienced in his expensive, empty life. The melody twisted and turned, sometimes playful and light, sometimes dark and stormy. Isabella's whole body moved with the music, swaying gently as her hands danced across the keys. Her eyes were closed again, and her face showed the pure joy of someone who had found their way back to something they thought they had lost forever. Richard, who had been preparing to make another joke, found himself leaning forward in his chair, completely captivated. David's phone lay forgotten on the table, its screen dark. Jennifer, who made her living judging art and culture, sat with her mouth slightly open, recognizing that she was witnessing something extraordinary. The music filled every corner of the apartment, bouncing off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, transforming the cold space into something warm and alive. The city lights twinkling beyond the windows seemed to pulse in rhythm with the melody. Even the expensive paintings on the walls seemed to be listening. Isabella reached the most challenging section of the piece, where the melody splits into multiple voices, each hand playing completely different rhythms and harmonies that somehow blend together into perfect unity. Her fingers flew across the keys so fast they were almost a blur, but every note was clear and precise. This was the kind of playing that required years of training, thousands of hours of practice, and a natural gift that couldn't be bought or taught. As the piece built toward its climax, the music became more intense and passionate. Isabella's hands moved from the highest notes to the lowest, creating cascades of sound that seemed to tell the story of every dream deferred, every hope that had been forced into hiding, every talent that had been dismissed because of circumstances. Beyond its control, the final section of the piece was triumphant and joyful. As if all the struggle and pain had led to this moment of perfect expression, Isabella's whole body was alive with the music, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that comes from doing exactly what you were born to do. And then, suddenly as it had begun, the music ended. Isabella played the final chord and let it ring out into the silence, her hands still resting on the keys, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. The apartment was so quiet you could hear the traffic 47 floors below. For a long moment nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. They were all still processing what they had just witnessed, trying to understand how their evening of cruel entertainment had transformed into something profound and beautiful. Isabella slowly lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. She opened her eyes and looked around the room, seeing 8 faces staring back at her in complete shock and awe. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of everything that had just been revealed. The silence in the apartment stretched on like a held breath. Isabella sat perfectly still at the piano, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for someone to break the spell that her music had cast over the room. She could feel 8 pairs of eyes staring at her, but she couldn't bring herself to look back at them. The magic of the moment was fading, and reality was creeping back in like cold air through a cracked window. Finally, it was Catherine who spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "My God," she said, shaking her head slowly. That was incredible." The words seemed to unlock something in the room. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once, their voices overlapping in excitement and disbelief. "I just heard," Richard said, running his hands through his hair. "That was professional level. Better than professional level." "Where did you learn to play like that?" Jennifer asked, leaning forward in her chair. As an art dealer, she knew talent when she saw it, and what she had just witnessed was pure, undeniable talent. David was still staring at Isabella like she had just performed magic. "I mean, seriously, where did that come from?" That was like watching a concert pianist. But Isabella didn't answer their questions. Instead, she quietly stood up from the piano bench and began to gather her cleaning supplies. The performance was over, and in her mind, it was time to return to reality. She was still the maid, still the invisible woman who cleaned their homes and served their drinks. One moment of music couldn't change that. "Wait," Alexander said, stepping forward. His voice sounded different now, confused, almost shaken. "Isabella, wait, please." She paused but didn't turn around. Oh. She could hear the change in his tone, but she had learned not to trust sudden kindness from wealthy employers. It usually didn't last long, that was. "I don't understand," Alexander continued, struggling to find the right words. "How did you... I mean, where did you learn to play like that?" Isabella finally turned to face him, and for the first time, since she had started working for him, Alexander really looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her. He saw the dignity in her posture, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength that he had somehow missed for 3 months. "I studied music, sir," Isabella said simply. "Back home? Studied music?" Catherine repeated, "That's putting it mildly." "You didn't just study music, you mastered it." Isabella felt tears threatening to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had learned to be strong, to not show weakness in front of people who held her livelihood in their hands. "If you'll excuse me, I need to finish cleaning the kitchen," she said, starting to walk away. "No, please," Alexander said, and there was something desperate in his voice now. "Please don't go. I need to... We need to talk." Isabella stopped walking, but didn't turn around. "About what, sir?" "About everything," Alexander said. "About why you're here? Cleaning my apartment? When you can play like that? About why I didn't know? About why... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The other guests had grown quiet again, sensing that something important was happening. They watched the exchange like spectators at a tennis match, their heads turning back and forth between Alexander and Isabella. "Sir, I really should finish my work," Isabella said, but her voice was softer now, less guarded. "Please," Alexander said again, "just... Please sit down. Let me get you something to drink. Let me apologize." Isabella turned around slowly, and Alexander was shocked to see the pain in her eyes. It wasn't fresh pain, it was old pain. The kind that comes from years of being overlooked, dismissed, treated as less than human. "You want to know why I'm here?" Isabella asked quietly. "Do you want to know why someone who can play Chopin is cleaning your bathroom?" Alexander nodded. Not trusting his voice, Isabella walked back to the piano and sat down on the bench. But this time she didn't play. She just sat there, looking at the keys that had just brought her back to life for a few precious minutes. "I grew up in Ecuador," she began, her voice steady but sad. "My family wasn't rich, but we weren't poor either.
Oh.
My father owned a small business, and my mother was a teacher. They saved every penny they could to pay for my music lessons." The room was completely silent now. Even the traffic noise from the street below seemed to have faded away. "Started playing when I was 5, Isabella continued. "By the time I was 10, my teachers said I had a gift. They recommended me for the National Conservatory. It was the best music school in the country, and getting in was like winning the lottery." She paused, running her fingers along the edge of the piano keys without pressing them. "I studied there for 8 years. Piano performance, music theory, composition. I learned pieces by Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, Rachmaninoff. I performed in recitals, competed in competitions. I won several national awards. My professors said I had a real future as a concert pianist." Alexander felt a heavy weight settling in his stomach. He was beginning to understand where this story was going, and he didn't like it. "What happened?" Jennifer asked gently. Isabella smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Life happened. The economy in my country collapsed almost overnight. My father's business failed. My mother got sick and needed expensive treatments. The conservatory raised their tuition prices, and my family couldn't afford to keep me enrolled." She stood up from the piano bench and walked to the window, looking out at the glittering city below. "I had a choice," she said. "I could stay home and watch my family lose everything, Or I could come to America and work whatever job I could find to send money back home. It wasn't really a choice at all. The weight in Alexander's stomach grew heavier. He thought about his own privileged life, about how he had never had to choose between his dreams and his family's survival. "So you came here," he said. "So I came here," Isabella confirmed. "I've been in New York for 2 years now. I've worked 3 jobs, cleaning apartments in the morning, working in a restaurant kitchen at night, and doing laundry for a hotel on weekends. I send almost everything I earn back home to help my parents and pay for my mother's medical bills." "But your music," Catherine said. "Your talent. You can't just give that up." Isabella turned back to face the room. "Talent doesn't pay rent," she said simply. "Talent doesn't buy medicine. Talent doesn't put food on the table. In America, I'm not Isabella the pianist. I'm just another immigrant looking for work." Alexander felt like he had been punched in the gut. For 3 months, he had walked past this woman every day, seeing her only as a service he was paying for. He had never bothered to learn her story, never asked about her dreams, never seen her as a complete human being with a life and history and talents that had nothing to do with cleaning supplies. "I had no idea," he said, his voice barely audible. "How could you?" Isabella asked, and there was no anger in her voice, just sadness. "You never asked?" The truth of her words hit everyone in the room like a slap. They were all wealthy, successful, people who prided themselves on being intelligent and worldly, but none of them had ever bothered to really see the people who worked for them, who cleaned their homes and served their food and made their comfortable lives possible. Isabella, Alexander said, stepping closer to her. "I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for tonight, for making you perform like that, for treating you like entertainment. But I'm even more sorry for the past 3 months, for not seeing you, for not knowing who you really are." Isabella looked at him for a long moment, studying his face. She could see that his apology was genuine, but apologies couldn't change the past or fix the future. "Thank you for saying that," she said finally. "But I should really finish my work now. You have guests to attend to." As Isabella started to walk away again, Alexander realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. He couldn't just let her go back to being invisible. He couldn't pretend that the last hour hadn't happened. He couldn't go back to seeing her as just a maid when he now knew she was so much more. "Isabella, wait," he called out one more time. "What if things could be different? What if there was another way?" Isabella stopped walking, but didn't turn around immediately. She had heard promises before from wealthy people who felt guilty about something. They usually lasted about as long as their guilt, which wasn't very long at all. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly, still facing away from Alexander. Alexander looked around the room at his guests. We're all watching this conversation unfold with fascination. For the first time in his life, he didn't care what they thought. Something had changed inside him during Isabella's performance, something he couldn't quite put into words yet. "I mean," Alexander said slowly, "that maybe we can find a way for you to be Isabella the pianist again, not just Isabella the cleaning lady." Isabella finally turned around, and Alexander could see the wariness in her eyes. She had learned to be careful about hope. It was a luxury she couldn't afford. "That's very kind of you to say," Isabella replied, "but I have responsibilities. I have bills to pay, family to support. Music is a beautiful dream, but dreams don't put food on the table." "What if they could?" Alexander asked, stepping closer. "What if we could make it work?" Richard, who had been quiet for several minutes, suddenly spoke up. "Wait a minute. You seriously telling me that our cleaning lady is a concert-level pianist, and we're just finding out about this now?" "She's not our anything," Alexander said sharply, surprising everyone, including himself. "Her name is Isabella, and yes, she's an incredibly talented musician who's been forced to work cleaning jobs to survive." The room fell silent again. Alexander's friends had never heard him speak to them like that before. He was usually so careful to maintain his social connections, so worried about fitting in with their wealthy circle. "Alexander's right," Catherine said suddenly. "I mean, what I just heard was extraordinary. Isabella, have you ever thought about teaching? There are wealthy families all over the city who would pay very well for piano lessons of that quality." Isabella looked at Catherine with surprise. She hadn't expected support from any of Alexander's friends. "I have thought about it," Isabella admitted, "but getting started is difficult. You need references, connections, a place to teach. Most wealthy families Want teachers who come recommended from their social circle? Well, Jennifer said, standing up from her chair, you just got the best audition of your life. I mean, I deal with artists every day, and what you just did was pure artistry. David nodded enthusiastically. And my daughter has been taking piano lessons for 2 years, and her current teacher isn't half as good as what I just heard. Would you consider teaching her? Oh, Isabella's eyes widened. She looked around the room, seeing faces that had been cold and dismissive an hour ago, now looking at her with respect and genuine interest. I don't know what to say, Isabella stammered. Say yes, Alexander said firmly. And I have an idea. Isabella, what if you could teach here, in this apartment? The piano is just sitting here unused anyway. You could give lessons to students who can afford to pay well, and you'd have access to a world-class instrument. Isabella stared at him in shock. You would let me use your piano? I would insist on it, Alexander replied. That piano has been silent for 5 years. It's about time it was used for what it was meant for, making music. The room buzzed with excitement as Alexander's friends began talking about the possibilities. Richard mentioned his nephew who needed a piano teacher. Catherine talked about her neighbor's children. Jennifer suggested advertising in the high-end art magazines she worked with. But Isabella still looked uncertain. Alexander, this is very generous, but I don't understand why you're doing this. A few hours ago, you didn't even know my name. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to answer her question honestly. You're right, he said finally. A few hours ago, I was living in a bubble. I thought my money made me important, made me better than other people. I thought success meant surrounding yourself with expensive things and people who could benefit. Your career. He gestured around the apartment, taking in all the luxury that suddenly felt cold and meaningless. But when you played tonight, I realized something. All of this stuff, all these expensive things I've collected, they're just objects. They don't have souls. They don't create beauty. They don't make the world better. But what you did tonight, that was real. That was valuable in a way that money can't buy. Isabella listened carefully, still not entirely convinced, but beginning to see that Alexander's offer might be genuine. Plus, Alexander continued with a small smile. I've been feeling pretty lonely in this big empty apartment. Maybe having music in here again would make it feel more like a home. Catherine raised her wine glass. I think this calls for a toast to Isabella for reminding us what real talent looks like. The others raised their glasses as well, but Isabella still stood apart, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. I need to think about this, Isabella said carefully. This is very generous, but I need to make sure I can still support my family. Of course, Alexander said. Take all the time you need, but I want you to know that this offer comes with no strings attached. Whether you take it or not, I will never again treat you or anyone else who works for me as invisible. The change is starting right now. Over the following weeks, Isabella did think about it. She talked to her family back home, calculated numbers, and slowly began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build a new life that honored both her responsibilities and her talents. She started with just 2 students, David's daughter and Richard's nephew. The lessons went so well that word spread quickly through New York's wealthy social circles. Within 2 months, Isabella had 8 regular students and a waiting list. Alexander kept his word about treating her differently. He learned about her family, her dreams, her favorite composers. They began having conversations over coffee, talking about music and life in the strange way that circumstances can bring 2 very different people together. Isabella moved out of her tiny studio apartment into a nicer place closer to Alexander's building. She was able to cut back to just one other job, working weekends at the restaurant. Most importantly, she was still able to send money home to her family. But now, she was also saving money for her own future. The piano that had sat silent for 5 years was now filled with music every day. Students of all ages came to learn from Isabella, and the apartment was transformed by the sound of scales, etudes, beautiful melodies. Alexander found that he looked forward to coming home each evening, knowing he might hear music drifting through his apartment. Sometimes he would sit in his living room and listen to Isabella's lessons. Amazed by her patience and skill as a teacher, 6 months after that fateful dinner party, Alexander made an unexpected decision. He signed up to take piano lessons himself. "Are you sure about this?" Isabella asked with a smile when he told her. "Learning piano as an adult is not easy, I'm sure," Alexander replied. "I've spent my whole life surrounded by expensive things, but never learning to create anything beautiful myself. I think it's time to change that." And so the millionaire who had once used his maid as entertainment became her student instead. It was a role reversal that taught them both something valuable about respect, humility, and the true meaning of wealth. The piano, once just an expensive decoration, became the bridge between two worlds that had seemed impossible to connect. And every day it filled the apartment with music that reminded everyone who heard it that the most valuable things in life can't be bought, they can only be shared.